Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on recovery leadership. My name is Amanda Leck, and I am the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. It is my pleasure to be the host of today's webinar. This is the third webinar in AIDA's Recovery Matters webinar series, which seeks to share knowledge and good practice for disaster recovery in the wake of Black Saturday. Today we have two guest speakers who I will introduce shortly, but first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. Here in Melbourne, that is the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that talking about recovering from disasters can be a difficult topic for many people. Today's webinar will include a story about the Christchurch earthquakes, which we'd like you to know in advance in case this raises anything for you. And of course, we encourage you to seek support from organisations such as Lifeline and Beyond Blue if you need to. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. We've had such strong demand for this webinar series, so to better cater to this demand, we've upgraded our webinar platform to Zoom. This is our first time running a webinar on Zoom, and we've had more than 630 people register. So we do ask for your patience if there are any issues while we learn how to best use this platform. We will be recording this webinar and uploading it to the Knowledge Hub for you to view again later on. All attendees are muted by default. You can use the chat function to introduce yourself and share thoughts and comments. However, we ask that if you do have a question, please use the Q&A feature. It's a button at the bottom of your screen and not the chat box for questions. As attendees, you will be able to upvote questions that you'd like answered by clicking the thumbs up button, and I will do my best to ask a number of these to our presenters during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We are very fortunate to have two speakers presenting at this webinar today, Jolie Wills and Elizabeth McNaughton from Hummingly in New Zealand. So let's get started, and I'll introduce our first speaker. Jolie Wills is a cognitive psychologist and co-founder and director at Hummingly, an enterprise that supports individuals, communities and organisations to do stress and uncertainty well. Jolie led the psychosocial recovery programming following the Christchurch earthquakes for New Zealand Red Cross. Jolie is a survivor of the Christchurch earthquake herself, living disaster recovery with her family firsthand. She and Elizabeth co-authored their book, Leading in Disaster Recovery, a companion through the chaos. Welcome, Jolie, and thank you.
Thank you. I'm just waiting for my screen to go live so that I can flick through the screens. But just to start, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. To state the obvious, recovery leadership is incredibly challenging. Oh, I've got to accept control of the keyboard. Now away. It's incredibly challenging. And Elizabeth and I are working after the Christchurch earthquakes. We had challenges that were keeping us awake at night. We had challenges that we were immensely curious about. And we had the really good fortune of having access to some amazing people that had previous recovery experience and some incredible knowledge. And that really informed our leadership, definitely for the better. But some of the challenges that we were also facing, we were just finding that there wasn't the existing knowledge to support us with that out there. And that led Elizabeth and I to do 2 Winston Churchill fellowships. So for Elizabeth, she was looking for some guidance to support recovery leaders and couldn't find anything at the time. So that led her to go seeking it. So she talked to recovery leaders around the world around their leadership insights and experiences. For me, the challenge that was keeping me up at night was around the exhaustion and the burnout that I was seeing amongst people working and really great people working in recovery, and thinking, what else should we be doing? What more can we do to better support these people? And so that led to Elizabeth and I both doing Winston Churchill Fellowship. So between us, we spoke to more than 100 people around the world and learned a lot about recovery leadership and gathered a lot of their insights. So today's session is all about some of those insights from the recovery leaders, but also some insights from Elizabeth and I ourselves from our work in Christchurch. So the way that we're going to do that, oh, sorry, I haven't got control of the slides, Melissa. You mind just advancing for me? Wonderful. So the way we're looking at doing that today is we've talked about or thought about this as R cubed. Oh, next slide, please. Oh, asking me to control. Sorry, bear with us a second while we get this sorted. So we've thought about this in terms of R cubed. So we're going to cover 3 different themes around recovery. We want to tell 3 different stories, and the plan was to share 3 different tools, so R cubed, but we've thrown our formula out a little bit in that we're going to cover 5 different tools and resources because we wanted to get really practical with some of the leadership insights today. So myself, I'm going to be talking through the very first theme, and then Elizabeth will pick up the second and third in her presentation, which follows. And what I want to do is start with a story. And so we'll start with recovery through knowledge. And it all started for me, this introduction to disaster recovery and recovery leadership began for me in the dark of night. It was 4:30 a.m. in the morning, still dark, on the 4th of September 2010. And I was jarred awake by a 7.1 magnitude earthquake. And, you know, I must say that I've encountered earthquakes before. I grew up with earthquakes. So like many New Zealanders, yeah, I'd experienced them before, but this was something entirely different. And I don't know how to describe it other than saying, you know, the violence of it was quite primal, and it was incredibly noisy. So to give you an indication, I was in a small town just on the outskirts of Christchurch that is quite close to railway lines on one side and underneath the flight path towards the airport. And for many people in our community, what they thought had happened was that either a train had come off the rails and was about to come through their back door, or a plane had come down and was about to come through their house. So it just gives you an indication really as to the sound and the noise and the violence of it. And just to give you an indication, these are the railway lines very close to our town, just a kilometre away. Gives you an idea around how much the ground moved under us and the sort of violence of it at the time. And so what happened for us was that, you know, we were jarred awake. My husband and I, quite intuitively and instinctively, there was no communicating because you just couldn't in the noise at the time. We went one to each of our children. So they were really relatively close by, the bedrooms. I went to my daughter and he went to our son. So my daughter was 6 and my son was 10. And went through and into the bedroom, and it was one of those moments where it was like our house had turned into a bit of an obstacle course, you know, trying to get through the door. We're ponging off walls, over floors that were moving, through doors that were flapping, furniture jumping, and we went one to each of our kids. And so I went to my daughter and was holding up a bookcase with one hand, you know, while trying to fish for her, you know, 30 kilos of her shaking around in a bed that was jumping around with the earthquake with the other. And eventually managed to get us under the door frame. It was the safest place in her room in terms of having a place where there's nothing to get under other than the door frame, where we knew nothing would fall on us. And I just remember at that time thinking very much around the fact that there's no way a building could move this amount and still stay standing. So in my mind, that, you know, this was it. And my role as a mum was very much to think about that, you know, how to be as calm as possible for my daughter at this moment. And so I thought I did a pretty amazing job of this. Like I would have given myself a gold star. But for the fact when the ground sort of stilled and settled a little bit, my daughter then piped up in her little small 6-year-old voice and said, "Mum, you're squeezing me too tight." So that was the experience that she had. And my son in the room next door still jokes to this day that actually having 100 kilos of his father fly in and land on him on top of him in his bottom bunk was almost as difficult for him or scary for him as the earthquake itself. So that was our introduction to disaster recovery. And What we didn't know would be the beginning of a lot of running and aftershocks. So we had, as many of you may know, 16,000 aftershocks in the upcoming years. One of them being the February earthquake that claimed so many lives. So, and what we also didn't know is that I was about to start a role in recovery leadership that I hadn't anticipated, all along with, you know, managing our family through this and our own repairs. So here's a picture of our kids at the time, and just to give you an indication of the length of recovery, the eldest one is now second year university, and our daughter is nearly finishing high school. Here they are, you know, many hours later, waiting for the ground to stop, sort of moving and groaning. We were having a bit of fun with the phone in the dark in the early hours of that morning. One of the challenges that we found is that how do you articulate that recovery juggle? You know, when you're juggling your own recovery yourself, you're juggling your recovery role and your role as a community member, your role as a leader. How do you juggle all of that and your repairs and everything else? And then how do you describe or articulate that juggle to others elsewhere? And it's often most difficult when you're trying to describe that to decision makers in places that aren't impacted by the disaster themselves. It's really hard for people to get their head around. And so in one of our resources, we created a card with a job description, and we'll introduce that resource shortly. But we created a card with a job description for life after disaster to try and help paint that picture for people. And I'll just read it to you. This is how it goes. Job description for life after disaster. Purpose, piecing life back together and creating a new future without everything falling apart. Hours, best not to know. Responsibilities, act as a de facto child psychologist, support your children through change and to make meaning of what has happened to them. Function as a morale officer for friends, family, neighbours and colleagues. Demonstrate off-road driving skills, navigate your way through damaged roads and closures to get to meetings or to school drop-offs. Additional shock absorbers not provided. Serve as a UN peacekeeper to tired and ratty colleagues. Come up with sensible answers to why isn't it fixed yet? Is this still a thing? Fulfill filing clerk duties, record and file an outrageous amount of disaster-related paperwork. Converse in legalese with insurance companies. Act as a 24-hour packing and removal contractor. And at a moment's notice, make like a construction foreman and oversee house repairs. All other duties as the disaster determines. All regular home, family, job and community responsibilities additional. So we've found that quite a useful way really of articulating the juggle that I know many of you will be dealing with right now. And Elizabeth and I, you know, we've been thinking about, you know, recovery it's difficult, it's really hard. But one of the reasons it is because we often don't have a sense of the journey that's ahead or how to navigate your way through it. And so for us, knowledge is such a key concept. It's just knowledge is really key. It's key for many reasons. One is that it can help give people confidence in their decision making through their recovery. It can really help normalize reactions, and it's incredible just the relief that you feel when you realize the reactions that you're experiencing are normal. And really important when we often lose that sense of power and control after a disaster that's really severely impacted for many people, is that knowledge helps restore some of that power and control. So for us, knowledge is really important for people to understand what's coming up ahead, what are the challenges, opportunities and strategies. You know, for us, that's hugely important. And Elizabeth and I, through the years since, we've been collecting stories and we've been sharing experiences across different disasters, you know, and often from different countries, and would have WhatsApp messages pinging across countries in the middle of the night. But we'd be swapping these stories and these experiences, greatly helped by our 2 Winston Churchill fellowships. And what we ended up doing was collating all of that into what is the Cards for Calamity. So the idea really is that we have what is often described as the typical recovery journey. And I just want to caveat that with saying this isn't everybody's journey, right? Everybody will, some people will have quite a different experience. And it's never ever this neat and tidy, right? Certainly in Christchurch, we had layers of multiple disasters in the last 10 years. And I know for people with the bushfires at the moment, you've got COVID to deal with. So it's never ever this neat and tidy. But on the other hand, we do find that this is a really useful depiction for people, and it can often reduce people's anxiety quite significantly and give them a sense around what's ahead. And I'll indicate why that is so important from my own personal experience later. But what the cards do is they take people through some of the different stages and steps and challenges that people can expect. And they do so by sharing stories from others that have been there before. They do so by sharing some questions that people can be asking of themselves or each other, and by sharing some strategies. So for example, as we know, after disaster, there are often promises made, you know, in the early stages by recovery leaders or politicians, and often with the best of intent, you know, with all that amazing upswell of support and feeling. But over time, we know that those promises can be really difficult to keep, and that causes distress and damage for people. And so there's a card in there sort of letting people know about the tendency for those promises to be made so that people can be looking out for them. Yeah, and then they can be setting their expectations differently. And also that card is helpful for recovery leaders too, to remind us to be really wary and careful in making promises. Further down the track, there's ones around, you know, just the length of recovery and how it's longer than many people expect. And helping people, when they realize that, to think about, well, how might I adjust my pace knowing that? Or how might I maintain or protect the things that I really love in my life, like my health and my family, the things that I value. And of course, there's cards also around growth, you know, individual and collective growth from disaster, and that being a possibility for many people. And again, I'll come back to why that is so important in a second. Actually, let's go there now. So what I wanted to do, and I've thought about this over the last few days around what are my own sort of personal insights and reflections from my own experience when it comes to the importance of knowledge to recovery, and sort of came to a couple of insights that I really wanted to share. One around why it's so important to you when you are an impacted person, and why it's so important to you as a leader. And for me, as an impacted person, I just want you to think about, we have in cognitive psychology this thing called the curse of knowledge, where once you know about something, once you have a piece of knowledge, it's really difficult to go back to imagining what it was like not to know it. So for many people who haven't, you know, seen that typical recovery trajectory or recovery graph, then their experience might be like this at a certain point, right? So you can imagine, here's me, you know, months after the event, but got a really long way in my recovery to go. So you could be sitting there at the bottom thinking, okay, I'm someone who normally identifies as an incredibly capable person, or at least I try to be a capable person. I feel a sense of responsibility for my loved ones and those around me and my colleagues and those that I support at work. And suddenly I'm in the spot and I look back and think I haven't coped the way that I would imagine or have thought or wanted to. And if you look at this trajectory or trend, where might someone think they're headed? You know, it's not looking incredibly positive or optimistic. And then instead, once you have an understanding that actually this is really normal and it doesn't preclude the fact that you may be on the journey to growth, that it really opens up and changes someone's perspective. It's a huge sense of relief, you know, that the experience that you're feeling, the coping that you're managing at the time, it's all very normal, and that you still may be on the road to some really good outcomes for you and your family, and to growth for you and your community. So for me, this was hugely important. Why it's so important to make sure that people have access to this knowledge, this recovery knowledge in communities. And then as a leader, you know, like many people, there's the whole imposter syndrome, right? And if as a leader, you're at a place with your team where everybody's tired, where people are frustrated, where decisions start getting impacted, yeah, by our psychology and our tiredness at this point, where at this point of the curve, it would be very easy to do a whole lot of self-flagellation as a leader, right? And to be really hard on yourself. But instead, if we know that this is part of the journey, there's some things that we can proactively do. So Elizabeth's going to talk a lot more about how we can best support the wellbeing and resilience of our team. But also some of the things in terms of, as a leader, when you hit the spot or even want to plan for the spot, there's a couple of things that we found really helpful. So One was really thinking about how do we define success at this point. So if at this point we may have been working really hard, but we may not be getting massive amount of appreciation from community members who themselves are really tired and understandably really frustrated, right? So it's not going to be all rainbow and unicorns within teams or from community members often at this point. And so if we can expect that we're going to get bitten occasionally by, not literally, like figuratively, someone will take a bite out of us, in the community, then what does success look like? And success in that point might look like, one, us not biting back, and continuing to be supportive and provide the best service that we possibly can. And the other thing is that at that point that we're not biting at each other, right? So that's the first step. So we set kindness as a default. We said it was really important when people were getting cranky and irritable and tired, that when someone is cranky with us, that we really set kindness as a default and we're generous with our assumptions. So in that instance, perhaps it's much more about what someone's carrying and having to deal with than it is about their personality and them as a person or about you personally. And that can really change the way interactions go, right? Setting that kindness as a default. And the other thing that was really helpful for us at this stage of things was to think about how do we really stack the deck, So this is something that you can charge all the people on your team, or collectively you can pick up the responsibility for. So when I say stack the deck, that means things like, how do we make sure that we are reaching out across divides, right? So there's often a national office versus regional office divide. Whatever those cracks or divides that start to show or were there already, how do we make sure each individually we take some responsibility for reaching across that divide with support, with acts of kindness, with connection. So we can do that within our teams, and we can do that outside of our teams as well. So it's just thinking about knowing when this is coming, understanding it's normal, and being able to then take some of the energy that you would spend self-flagellating, taking that and really thinking about how do we do something constructive and positive to mitigate some of this and to keep unity so that we can keep doing some great things as a team. So those were really my sort of personal reflections on why knowledge is just so incredibly important, having access to knowledge and recovery. And I just want to finish with, my really last message or piece of advice, and that's, as leaders, do whatever you possibly can to build your own recovery knowledge. And I know what it's like to be in that space. I know how busy you are, how little time and energy you have. So it's not the time to necessarily dig in and do your PhD, yeah. But there are amazing people out there who have a wealth of recovery experience and knowledge. So make sure that you have access to those kind of people, access the resources that are out there. Sheep dip your people and recovery knowledge as much as you possibly can. Anyone in the recovery system that are going to be interacting with community members, the more they know about recovery and that knowledge, the better. And lastly, make sure that impacted people have really good access to recovery knowledge so that they can best lead themselves and their families, in their communities to the best place possible. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jolie, and thank you for sharing your recovery knowledge with nearly 400 people online today. It's been really interesting. We're now going to move to Elizabeth McNaughton. Elizabeth is a co-founder and director at Hummingly. Previously, she was the executive director of the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Learning and Legacy Program for New Zealand's Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Prior to taking on that role, she held senior leadership positions at New Zealand Red Cross, including National Recovery Manager for the Christchurch earthquakes. Her international experience includes working for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies based in South Asia. And I'll remind you to please use the Q&A function. We have 10 minutes for questions and answers with the presenters following Elizabeth's presentation. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Kia ora. So I will just see if I have control here. It looks like I do. So I'll be tackling our second topic around recovery through leadership. And so my career has quite literally been a series of disasters. And, you know, it's quite a responsibility, a privilege, but also a responsibility to work to support disaster affected people. After the Christchurch earthquake, I really felt that sense of responsibility. I had a large team and we had a $130 million appeal. And after we'd been working extremely hard to do the best we can for some time, I had this feeling that was, are we doing the best we can? Is what we are doing best practice? Could we do better? And these questions started to worm away in my head, unfortunately, sometimes at 2 a.m. I thought, look, have to deal with these questions. And so that was the beginning of this Winston Churchill process. And Jolie had her own wormy questions. And so we went about talking to amazing people all over the world. And what we really focused on was, if you were to go back before this disaster, what is the one thing that you would tell yourself, that one piece of advice? And so we worked on that, collated all of our responses, and we created the resource that we wished we had had, and that is Leading in Disaster Recovery. And so in this one resource, you can have all of that wisdom. You can download it from the Global Disaster Preparedness Centre, from New Zealand Red Cross, and I think Australian Red Cross have some hard copies as well. So that wisdom is available to you. And that just made me feel so much better, having asked all of those questions and having that sense of that collective wisdom. Following up from Jolie's point, it's really important if you are in a role of recovery leadership, wherever and whatever that looks like, is to really create your own personal board. So those people around you who can help support you, guide you, and who can offer some of their wisdom from being there before. So that's what got us through, and we hope you enjoy this resource and the wisdom from many people in there. One of the key things that came out of that work was, it's really important as a recovery leader to ask the right questions of the right people at the right time. To demonstrate some of this, I've chosen 3 questions today. Hard to choose just 3, but let's go through those. Okay, so the first question, are all sectors and levels represented in my address book? After a disaster, it's really common for us to want to pull together those people that we know and trust to help us solve problems and to help us feel more comfortable. The irony is we actually need diversity of thought to solve problems well. So it's really important in advance if possible, but to always look for people in different sectors with different perspectives and different levels of hierarchy who you can connect with, so that when you're in a tight spot, you can ring them and you have that trust to really help you solve problems. You know the recovery petal diagram? Actually, what that is in reality is a network of people from different sectors working together. After the Christchurch earthquakes, we ran a bit of an experiment, a learning experiment, and we moved the Red Cross recovery team in with the engineers who were rebuilding the roads and the horizontal infrastructure to see what we could do practically to learn what that collaboration between the built and social environments looked like. And it was amazing what we could achieve, and it was a really rich learning experience. So I'd really encourage you to ask yourself this question. Get your address book out at some point and look through it and think, are there people from different parts of that recovery petal diagram in here? Are there people at different levels of government? Do I have the people I need in here? So yes, test the resilience of your own address book, because in recovery, as you will all know, relationships are everything. Excellent. Our second question. Yes. How represented are communities in my calendar compared to other stakeholders? What happens is, as leaders, it's the people that we're meeting with regularly who are influencing us, who are influencing our decision making, our thinking, our problem solving. And what can happen is that you can end up filling your calendar with people like you, people from your organisation perhaps, or if you're in government, it can become filled with a lot of other government people. And it's good to stop and check as a recovery leader, who am I meeting with? What voices am I taking on? Who is influencing me here? And then being intentional about your calendar to ensure that you are meeting with the diversity of voices that you need to make good decisions. Question 3. Yes, this one. This is probably the most profound one to me. So in speaking with recovery leaders around the world, there was a characteristic that people really respected in their recovery leaders, and that was being calm and being steady. But on further discussion, a lot would say, especially a number who had a really rough ride, which happens, and had some pretty difficult burnout issues, or even some mental health troubles, which is also quite normal. They said, you know, what was upsetting or quite scary about that is I was in this difficult place, but I think my team were 3 or 4 weeks behind me. So it's really important as a recovery leader to think, where am I at? Yeah, what have I done to support my own well-being and self-care so that I can be in the most steady, calm place I can be? And then the second part to it is, so where am I leading others to? Yeah, am I leading them to that place of calm, or am I leading them potentially to a place that is unsteady and not healthy? So I ask myself this one on the regular. Okay. All right. So enough questions from me. It's now time for a chat bomb. I don't know if any of you have done a chat bomb before, but we're going to try it out and see how we go. So you'll see the chat function at the bottom, and it's awesome. I've seen people from all over the place in there. Really great. So what I would like you to do is enter the answer to this question I'm going to give you, but don't press enter, okay? We're going to give everybody a chance to put in their answer, and then we're going to hit enter together, okay? So the question is, what is the number one recovery leadership question you have on your mind right now? And we'll give you 30 seconds just to think about that and put the answer in the chat, but please don't push enter. Okay, this is a really easy way too to see who's listening to the instructions. Okay, so 30 seconds on what is the number one recovery question on your mind right now? And remember, don't push enter just yet. Give you another. No problem. There's always a few. Okay. All right. Okay. So you're going to push enter in 3, 2, 1, enter. Whoa. It's amazing. How to get started. Resilience of recovery staff. What's the plan? How do we define what's normal? Excellent. Beginning with the end in mind. Absolutely. Love that. Okay, so I hope that I have to stop myself reading the chat because it's so interesting. But I really hope that that little exercise can help you see that many others also have the same leadership questions that you do. It's really normal, and it's really good to question yourself, to question others in a gentle and kind way to help find your way forward. So recovery leadership, absolutely, it's about being prepared to ask the right questions of the right people at the right time. Okay, and now I'm going to talk about recovery through people. And I've worked with different teams through different disasters all over the world, and something that's common and disturbing is that pretty much in all of them, in some way or another, we were burning people out. And when you're there to do good and when you're there to support people, that's a horrible thing. And we did a lot of, Jolie and I were really aware of it, and we did a lot of thinking around that. Because there's two ways it can go. This experience of disaster recovery leadership can really pull and push at your boundaries, right? And give you that amazing space where you can grow, where you can think harder, you can work faster, and you can really achieve more than you thought was possible of yourself. You can gain new skills, new insights, new relationships, and that all of that growth as a leader can be really amazing. And then there can also be the flip side to that. When stress is not managed well, or it goes on too long and it's cumulative and insidious, and that recovery is such a long journey, it's also common for the recovery leadership experience to result in damage. So it's a really fine balance between growth and damage. But as a recovery leader, it's really important to have this in your mind so you can be really intentional about how, if possible, you can lead others towards this place of growth rather than damage. And it's not easy, and it is a fine line, but it's really important as a leader to be aware of. And so Jolie and I created something for ourselves and our teams to really help people to do well, manage stress well, and support their resilience and performance. So that's a resource that we put together to help through that process. Another tool, if you would like to check out supporting the supporters. So these are the results of Jolie's Winston Churchill Fellowship, and really helpful insights, 12 principles of support, super simple stuff to help support you and your team. Because sometimes the focus can be all on the community, or all on the issues, or all on the organizational nitty-gritty tough stuff, and we ourselves can get lost. So supporting the supporters needs to be really upfront in our recovery thinking and planning, and this will help you with that. Yes, another tool, and you can check out a range of Jolie videos on this, which are really helpful, is a piece that was done with DELP. So all about looking after the mental health and well-being of people working in recovery. So this is another one that you can check out. And it's just good to know that there are so many tools, there are so many learnings from other disasters that are all there to help you right now, because it can feel really daunting, really endless, really complicated and fraught, but there is so much around to help you right now. So just take that to heart. Yes, let's... Oh. Okay, so that has been our presentation today. So if you just remember our cubed recovery through knowledge, deeply understand the recovery experience so you can plan for it. Recovery through leadership, be prepared to ask the right questions of the right people at the right time, and recovery through people. Without resilient and well people, nothing can be resilient. So kia ora and thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you, Jolie, as well. That was two very good presentations. We have a number of questions that have come through the Q&A. I did love your chat bomb. We've not done that before, so this is all new to us as well. So some people are asking if the responses to that chat bomb will be available as part of the recording of this webinar. We'll obviously have to figure out the technology, but our aim is to make all of these resources available to all participants. So we'll do our best. So there's a few questions relating to COVID, so I'll just sort of group them together. But in Australia, we've been through a massive bushfire season in New South Wales and elsewhere, and then of course we had the floods, and now we're straight into COVID-19. So people are asking, how do we effectively lead in recovery in response to now what we're experiencing through this global pandemic of COVID-19?
We're looking at each other to see who should talk.
Who would like to take that one?
Elizabeth, go ahead.
I'll kick off and then you can follow on, Jolie, if firstly, we're hearing a lot of the word unprecedented. It's really, every time I turn on the radio, unprecedented, unprecedented, unprecedented. I think what we're not thinking about is the many precedents for recovery from all sorts of things across time. Humans throughout our history have recovered and adapted to all sorts of challenges. And in recent years, with different disasters, we have got better at learning from those disasters. We've got better at putting tools together. We've got better at building networks to support each other. And I would say actually that we have a lot that we can draw on for this COVID recovery. I think about that petal diagram that's 100% still at the centre of this recovery. I think about all of the economic recovery programs that I've been involved in, all of the social economic programs I've been involved in, and all that we've learnt and the principles that we have. And I think we need to have confidence in our past experience, confidence in the history and adaptations of people, and use that and use those learnings to lead others, would be what I would say.
I would agree. Yeah, absolutely. I think you probably heard unprecedented with the Black Saturday bushfires, right? We would have heard unprecedented, we certainly heard it in Christchurch, right? Heard it with 9/11. We heard it with the fires that you've had this last season. We've heard it with COVID, and it's not to underplay anyone who's been involved or impacted by any of those disasters. We just think unprecedented is our new normal, and actually there is a huge amount of learning and practice that has evolved through time. I think it's very easy for people, especially leaders, when you're new to it, and I know what that is like. You come to something that's new and feels like hasn't been encountered before, and people are tempted to reinvent the wheel. And I think actually there's a huge amount of knowns, even though it feels, there's a lot of unknown. That is usually the case. It always feels like you need to contextualize. Every disaster is different. Every community is different. There's always those bits that will need to be, you're designing the plane while you're flying it in a sense, but there's a huge amount of resources that we can fall back on, and commonalities more than differences.
And I saw in the chat Boxing Day tsunami,
yeah,
and that's where I cut my teeth on recovery. And I remember, very much something that came out of that recovery was Bill Clinton and his Build Back Better concept. And I would actually argue that we should be talking nowadays more about build forward better, because there is no back, and we are adapting and evolving to a new place in this. But the principle remains the same through this COVID pandemic, through everything that's going on right now, you know, how do we build forward better to mitigate for a deeper emergency here, which is the climate emergency? And so how do we use this recovery to mitigate against future disasters that we know are coming with increased intensity and frequency, and communities are experiencing that all around the world? So as recovery leaders, how do we look for those strategic opportunities to build forward better in this environment and take us to a new and better place for future recoveries and for the future of our kids?
So Elizabeth always sparks thinking in me. So when she says that, what I think of is way back in the sort of 1960s, you know, there was a quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's essentially that the first plan in everybody's mind when they think about recovery is what was there before. Right? That's what we tend to, especially when we're in anything that's, we talk about nuts, right? Anything that's new, uncertain, is a threat to the way that we do things, or impacts our sense of control. That really gets our threat system going, right? And so we're in that, when we're feeling in that sort of very survival threatened stage, then it's very hard to think creatively and think differently. We're going to really want to hold on to what is familiar. So how do we make sure during these times that we're really thinking about not necessarily going back to what was, keep what we valued that worked for many people, right? You know, and but be quite intentional about thinking, what do we want, what matters, where do we want to be in a recovery, and resist going back to what was, you know, where it's not
Jolie
helpful.
and Elizabeth, there's a few more questions that we'd like to get through. So there's a number of questions around things like burnout, setting boundaries, maintaining energy levels. Would you like to make some comments about how you do that, especially, you know, in this very intensive period, you know, post bushfire and now into COVID?
Okay, I'm getting the eyebrow. Right, it's me. So one of the learnings for me, and you know, when you're having to live what it is that you're preaching, it's not easy. You know, it's really difficult, because often you know you need to, and it's often difficult to implement. But for me, I guess my personal learning was the realization, and it's obvious, but the realization that your time and energy really is finite. So being very protective of making sure that that time and energy can be directed to the things that are incredibly important to you, the impact you want to have in your work, your family, you know, so have a look at your to-do list and make sure that those things are reflected on there. And as leaders, it's so important that you do, it's great that you're thinking about those boundaries, because if you can model that, often we heard one of the biggest challenges for burnout was the fact that the leaders were modeling behavior that was really difficult. People felt that they had to also work crazy hours. And so as leaders, if you can maintain those boundaries, do it for yourself, but also for your people, really important, and be clear about why. So your time and energy is finite. You need to be really conscious about where it's going, what you can say no to, and be really clear that you're modeling this because it's important that everybody does. Otherwise, we won't last the distance and have the great impact we really want to have with affected communities.
Yeah, I remember I was in rural Bangladesh after a cyclone, and I was I was really unwell, and I found a pharmacy, and the chap didn't speak English, and he pretty much just opened the door and was like, choose what you want, kind of thing. And so I was scratching around this pharmacy in rural Bangladesh looking for something to help me so that I could keep working to help others, without seeing the irony of that. It was only years later I thought, actually, I, of course, need to focus more on my own physical health so that then I can support others. And so what I would do when I got sick was work harder to try and maintain the same level of support to others and make myself sicker. And of course, that is no way to perform as a leader in recovery, but I was so like overcome with the noble purpose, if you like. I didn't see that at the time, and that's one of the things that really happens as a recovery leader. You lose perspective, and that's why you need others to really support you in that, to show you what you can't see. And Dr. Kate Brady, your wonderful Dr. Kate Brady, has a really great Martyr professional story And she really helped me see a lot of that through the Christchurch times, and I'm really grateful to her for that.
I would encourage people also to have a look at that Supporting the Supporters website, because on there is a report and it has in the back a whole list of the impacts, the real impacts that people reported experiencing themselves or in colleagues, you know, the very adverse impacts, along with all the positive things that come from working in the space. But if we're unable to manage our boundaries and our stress well, that will lead to adverse impacts for ourselves, our loved ones, our work, our organisation, the communities we're trying. If it was any other hazard, we would be, you know, scaffolding or anything else, we'd be dealing with it quite differently. So important.
So how do we know, so there's a few questions around, how do we know that if we're in that leadership position and we're working with others, how do we know that we're doing it well? What are some of the key indicators that are saying, yes, this is going along okay, my team are coping with this?
I'm going to give you the eyebrow, Elizabeth.
I think one of the first indicator needs to be how well am I as a recovery leader, and how well is my team, and how are they functioning so we can support others. I would put that as the first point on what success looks like. And the second point would be, I would look at that the relationships with other organisations and how collaborative my team was, how collaborative I was, what the strength of my relationships were like across the recovery system. Because it's only when we collectively work together and support each other across a system and get rid of organisational nonsense and ego that we can do our best work. So those would be indicators of success for me also. And of course, the feedback and the learning from working with communities and holding that at the heart of what we do. So what are they telling us about our work and how we are doing, and how are their needs guiding us, and holding that the community as our collaboration anchor, and that is our noble purpose, and using that to paint the vision. And coming back to that at all times, you know, even and bringing everybody back to that when, you know, people get ratty and tired and you get that nonsense that comes up, and coming back to that. So how well are we articulating that vision, holding that as a collaboration anchor, and holding others to that would be my third point of success. The other thing is, it's really important to manage expectations and expectation management, starting with yourself. As a recovery leader, I always think if you come through this journey okay, that is huge success. It's such a difficult role, and it's such a long process that with often competing tensions, conflicts, all sorts of things, that to come out okay is a huge sign of success. And to support communities to navigate through this process to a point where they feel okay is also a huge success. You can't have the same success indicators for recovery that you have for business as usual or other things. So when you're determining for yourself and your team what success looks like, I just encourage a gentle approach and a deep understanding of that recovery journey to frame that right from the beginning.
I'd agree that recovery journey is really important. And we talked about that job description. So one question to ask yourself is, how well do we understand that recovery job description, the things that people are juggling? How well do we understand that for different community members? How well do we understand that for leaders and communities? And how well are we using that and them to inform the design of the systems that they are then encountering, you know, the systems that we're designing to support? So how much of that is, or are we doing things that the systems are designed because it's easier and expedient at our end? Do we have the end user, the disaster affected person at the heart of what we do and our understanding of their realities? Yeah.
Well, look, I think we're just about out of time, Jolie and Elizabeth. I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank you all again. We'll give you a virtual thumbs up or a clap from all the people online. It's been really, really informative, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. We had nearly 400 people online today, so I think that's a record for us. So clearly the new platform has worked, and we'll certainly be employing future chat bombs. So thank you, ladies, for introducing us to that. We will be sending everyone online a recording of today's webinar. You'll get a link in an email from us, and there'll also be a link to the recovery collection on the Knowledge Hub, where there's a lot of great resources. And as you said, there's a lot of knowledge out there. There's a lot of resources that people who perhaps are a bit new to this can tap into, and we certainly encourage you to do that. We also encourage you to build your networks. There's a lot of people online who've declared where they're from, and if you can make touch with, get in contact with people who can support you and increase that address book that you spoke about. That's probably another thing you can take away from this webinar as well. So we'll be running future webinars. This is our third in the series of Recovery Matters webinars. Stay tuned. We'll be sending out information about another webinar in another 2 or 3 weeks' time. We're really keen to continue to hear from participants about what you need, what learnings you're looking to help you to do your job better and to work with communities who are recovering better. So please get in touch with us. There'll be a short survey, and we would really welcome your feedback on what you would like to hear from us, and we will find appropriate speakers such as Jolie and Elizabeth today, who were kind enough to give us the benefit of their experience and their wisdom. So thank you again so much, Jolie and Elizabeth, and good afternoon, everyone.
Kia ora, and thank you for having us.